Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 1 lecture. So one thing I forgot to mention in part 1, our required textbook. Please buy it as soon as possible if you don't already have it. It's called Literature, appropriately enough, a portable anthology, and we want the 5th edition. So the title and the ISBN number for the book can be found on the first page of the syllabus. Also, if you go to the GBC bookstore website and search by the class or search using my name, you should be able to access the book there. And you can order the book through the GBC bookstore if you'd like, but you can also just Google the title or punch in the ISBN and you can find it online. You can order it through any number of online booksellers. Amazon has it. There are other places to find it as well. You can find used copies, you can find electronic versions, so whatever works for you. I don't have a lot of strong preferences. You certainly don't have to buy a brand new version of the book. Used copies will work just fine, and ebooks work just fine as long as you have the book. So if you don't have it already, make sure you order it as soon as possible. I would like everybody to have the book by the end of this week so you're able to complete this week's reading assignment, and then of course you'll be able to catch up or keep up, I should say, with all future reading assignments. Pretty much everything we read throughout the semester will be in the book. It's a very large book, so it consists of sort of typical textbook chapters, and it also has reading selections, examples of fiction, poetry, and drama. So we'll be using both parts of the book, the textbook chapters and the reading selection. So it has pretty much everything we need. There might be a time or two when I post some PDFs in the modules if there's any additional reading that I might want you guys to do, but for the most part, everything that we read is in the book. So obviously, you need the book. Let me know if you're having any problems, or if you have any questions about the book. If you're having any problems finding it, just let me know. All right, so as I've already said, we're jumping right into the book this week. And here in week 1, we're going to cover chapter 1 and chapter 2. So let's go ahead and get started. A lot of the stuff in these chapters is pretty self-explanatory, pretty basic. Some of it might already be familiar to us, but I do want to emphasize a few key concepts that I think really are important for us, beginning in chapter 1. And the first thing they talk about in chapter 1 is this idea, this claim. It's really a complaint that you've heard before, probably at some point, maybe from an English teacher, or you've heard it somewhere else, this idea that people don't read anymore. Or at least people in our culture, our society, don't read as much as we used to. And there is probably some truth to that. At the very least, what we read has changed over time. We certainly don't read the same kinds of things that we read 100 years ago, or even 50 or 25 years ago. Obviously, technology has changed. We have a lot of different types of texts that exist now that did not exist in previous eras, previous generations. So the nature of our reading has changed. But as the book points out, we still read. It's actually not accurate to say that people don't read anymore. We do read. As the book points out, we are bombarded all day long with written messages. And think about that. We can all think of examples of the kinds of things that we have to read on a daily basis. In the book, they mention things like billboards, emails, text messages. These are obviously very common things for us to read in our everyday lives. Websites, flyers, or billboards, street signs, other things that you might see while you're out driving. And then obviously Text messages, emails, and social media, those are really new forms of technology, new forms of reading that did not exist in previous eras. So we all do some kind of reading on social media, whether we're looking at updates or we're looking at things that have been retweeted or shared with us. We visit websites. We're all on the internet a fair amount. Even if you're not online all day, you're probably reading something online. Maybe a news article, maybe just social media, but you are reading. Even when we watch television, I know some people don't watch TV, but if we do, while we're watching, we're often reading. We might be reading some kind of news update or the ticker on the bottom of the screen, especially if we're watching sporting events or a news program. So we read all the time. We read so much that we don't even think about it. We don't even notice how much reading we're doing. And yes, it's true, a lot of this reading is very simple. It does not take very long. The things that we are reading, they're not very complex. They're not very hard to understand. As the book points out, most of this kind of reading that we do on a day-to-day basis is informational. These types of texts like street signs or even the instructions that come along with furniture that we might have to assemble. All of that stuff, maybe a text message as well. We're only reading it because of the information it contains. We're only reading those texts so we can extract the important information and then use that information to accomplish some kind of a goal. So it doesn't take long to do that. It does not take a lot of deep thinking. We don't really need to analyze an instruction manual or a text message or a billboard. They're usually pretty straightforward, self-explanatory. They give us information that we need, and then we move on. But it's important to remember that we read a lot. So even though literature is a very different type of text, it requires different techniques, different reading strategies. It's a very different kind of reading experience from what we might be doing on a day-to-day basis. But we do read. We are literate, obviously. We already have some foundational reading skills that we can build on in this class. In a similar way, we already write, even if we don't think that we like to write. Maybe we don't think of ourselves as creative writers, but we do write. And I'm sure some of us do probably enjoy writing creatively or maybe keeping a journal. But even if you don't do those things, you still write. Think about workplace situations. We often have to write memos or reports or at least emails in the workplace. You often have to do those kinds of writing for classes as well. If you're in a science class, you probably have to do a lab report of some kind. And of course, emailing is pretty universal. We all do it to some extent or another. We all write text messages. Most of us are on social media. We are often writing things there. We might just write a grocery list before we go to the store. We might write a note for ourselves or a little reminder note for a significant other or a roommate or a family member. So these are simple texts, easy to understand. They don't take us very long to write. They're not difficult to write, but we still engage in both reading and writing on a daily basis. So we already have a lot of the basic skills that we need. In this class, we're going to be focusing on literature, of course, and literature is different from notes and emails and text messages. We already know that. So because literature is more complex, it's often going to be longer, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, more moving parts. We have to do a little bit more work to uncover the meaning. Literature is not strictly informational. Literature does contain information, but that's not all it contains. And we're not reading literature strictly to extract the information. That's what makes it different. We have to dig deeper. We have to look more closely. We have to spend more time, spend more effort on literature, both when we're reading it and when we're writing about it. And that's largely what this class is all about. There's a specific set of skills that you need to develop in order to read literature and then write about it successfully on the college level. And this class is all about helping you to develop those skills. That's what we're doing in here. So in chapter 1, they also talk about some of the reasons why we read literature. I don't want to spend too much time on that. It's pretty self-explanatory in the book, but they're making some good points. Obviously, literature for many people is entertainment. A lot of us read literature because it's fun, because it's enjoyable, because it's interesting, whether we're reading novels, short stories, poems, maybe a play, even stuff like graphic novels, comics can often be considered literature nowadays. So we like stories. People typically like stories. We like characters. We like to read about things that those characters do. We like to get lost in an intricate plot, or we like to go far away and occupy some strange new setting. Maybe we're on a different planet. Maybe we're in a previous time period. We like stories. We like to leave our everyday life and sort of take a flight of imagination. That's fun for a lot of people. So literature is entertainment. It's fun for many of us, not for all of us, and it's okay if you don't really enjoy literature in that way. But it can serve an entertainment purpose. It can have value as entertainment. But as they say in the book, there's a lot more to it beyond entertainment and enjoyment. Literature can also expand our minds. Literature can teach us about the world. And sometimes this is a little strange for people because they're like, yeah, but isn't literature fiction? Right? I mean, most of what we're reading is fictional, which means it's not real. It's not true. It didn't actually happen. But nevertheless, it's still a great way to learn. Because even if we're reading a fictional story, it didn't really happen, but something like it probably did happen. Even if it's science fiction or fantasy and it doesn't bear any resemblance to everyday life, we're still going to find certain aspects of it that feel real. Maybe we can relate to certain characters. Maybe we can really understand a particular situation or a particular clash of personalities because we've experienced something similar or we've witnessed something like that. So no matter what the story is, no matter how fantastical it is, no matter how out there it is, we're always going to find something to relate to, something that we can connect to, something that strikes us as authentic, real, something that all humans, or at least all people in a particular culture, in a particular time and place, can understand. So that's a big part of what literature does for us. It teaches us things. Literature can teach us about the bigger world out there. We can learn about other people, other places, other cultures. We can be transported to other historical time periods. We can learn a little bit about history, but we also learn about people, different kinds of people, how people think, how people feel, how people interact with the world and with others. And this can all be beneficial for us. And of course, in addition to learning more about the world, that's really what reading literature does for us. But eventually, of course, we're going to be writing about literature. And as the book says, writing about literature allows us to learn more about ourselves. We can get more in touch with our own feelings, our own opinions, our own ideas by trying to, again, connect to the literature to better understand it. So a lot of benefits come from this kind of work. We're learning more about the world. We're expanding our minds through reading. And then when we start writing, we're going to get more in touch with our own feelings, our own thoughts, our own ideas and interpretations. And that's obviously valuable too. So we're going to be practicing some of the strategies and techniques that we need in order to successfully approach literature. Because again, the way we read literature will be different than how we read those informational texts, those easy texts that we were talking about before. Obviously, when we're reading literature, we have to pay closer attention. If we're reading a website or a street sign or a billboard or even a text message, we're often reading passively. That means we're not thinking very hard about what we're reading. We're just sort of taking it in. We're just looking at the words. It's all pretty simple. It's all self-explanatory, so we don't have to think very hard about what it is that we're reading. We don't have to analyze it. We don't have to ask questions about it. We don't have to ponder the meaning behind the text. It's all right there. It's all pretty much on the surface, and we understand it immediately. So passive reading is fine if you're checking on your favorite sports team, or you're sending a brief text or reading a brief text from your friend. But when we're reading literature, we can't be passive. We can't be distracted. We should not be multitasking. And I know a lot of students, when they're reading, they are also doing 3 or 4 other things. They're carrying on conversations with other people. They have various browsers open on their computer. They're on their phone. They have music playing. Maybe the TV's on in the background. Again, that's all right for certain types of reading. But when you're reading literature, you don't want all of those distractions. You need to stop the conversations, close the windows, turn off the TV. Now, music can be a nice accompaniment while reading for some people, but you need to pick the right kind of music. Like if you find a certain kind of music to be relaxing, or if you find a particular song or artist to be helpful when you're trying to focus or really pay close attention, then by all means, use it. Have it playing at a reasonable volume while you read, but we might not want really loud, aggressive music, although everybody's different, everybody reads differently, but try to find music that will not distract you. You really have to focus hard on the literature, and clearly we have to read from start to finish, right? With some of those informational readings, we might skim. Like we said, we might browse. It's all very easy. We don't have to really look too closely, and we might even be able to skip a word or two, but that's not the case with literature. We always have to read the text, the literary text, in its entirety, from start to finish. No browsing, no skimming. In some cases, we might have to reread certain parts of that literary text. We might have to go back and read a passage or a paragraph a second or even a third time. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It means that we don't want to be multitasking. We need to be locked in, focused, and we need to be reading actively. That means with a pen in hand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to chapter 2. But like they say in the book, you need to devote sustained attention when you're reading literature. And I know some of us get distracted easily. That's just a symptom, I think, of living in the modern world. But we have to fight that when we're reading literature. You're going to have to focus for a pretty long period of time. But also remember, if you're reading something kind of lengthy, you can always break it up into multiple shorter reading sessions. So that can make it a little bit more manageable. But be ready when you're reading literature. Be ready to sit down for 30 minutes or maybe an hour, maybe a little bit more, and devote all of your attention to that work of literature. And if you can do that, if you can read the right way, you're going to really start to develop important skills. Sustained attention is a skill. Being able to pay attention, close attention, for a long period of time, that's a very useful skill, not just in an English class, but in all of your classes and in all of your future endeavors. Also, reading effectively will allow you to become more introspective. As they say in the book, to be introspective just means that you're examining your own mental and emotional processes. It means that you're in touch with yourself. You're beginning to know yourself and your thoughts and ideas a little bit better. So, like I said, reading's good for that, but writing about literature is especially good for introspection. So we're going to be developing that skill. And also the skill of analysis, a very applicable skill. Analyzing comes in handy not just in a literature class, not just in an English class, but in all sorts of different classes. Because we can analyze anything. Obviously, in this class, we're analyzing literature. But we can analyze car engines, we can analyze people, we can analyze historical events, we can analyze plants. It just depends on the context and what class you're in. So analysis is a really good skill to develop because it will always help you in the future. Also, reading will make you more articulate. It will make you more thoughtful. It will get you in touch with language. We're going to think and talk a lot about language in this class and how language works. So you'll learn a lot about language. You'll learn about the world. And you'll just become a more interesting, well-informed person. Those are the virtues, the benefits of reading. And chapter 2 gets into reading a little bit more, talking about the nuts and bolts of how to read literature. So I want to spend some time on this. When we read literature, we need to be active, critical readers. So when I say critical, I don't mean like, oh, you're finding fault, you're insulting somebody. I don't mean critical like that. I mean critical in the sense of asking questions and digging beneath the surface. Really thinking about meaning. That's what critical thinking is all about. Asking questions, figuring things out, exploring, and arriving at your own original conclusions. That's what we need to start doing. So to be a critical reader at this early stage mostly means that you're asking questions and you're paying attention to meaning. You're really thinking about meaning. Even if that means going beneath the surface. And I've already mentioned active reading. Active reading is the opposite of passive reading. So when we read passively, we're distracted, right? We're not paying 100% attention. We're just kind of looking at a text very briefly to get what we need, and then we move on. But that's not what we're doing in here. So to read actively means to have a pen or pencil in hand, and it means that you need to annotate. You need to take notes as you read. All right, this is a sign that you're paying close attention and that you are engaging successfully with the text. So again, we don't have to do all of this stuff with everyday informational text, but we have to do it with literature. So they talk about annotating in chapter 2. I want to go through that, but first I want to go over what they discuss with speed, the speed of reading. A lot of students try to get through their reading assignments very quickly. They try to go as fast as possible, either because they just want to get done, they're very busy, they have other things to do. I can understand that impulse. But when you're reading literature, it really does not benefit you to go really quickly. There's no prize for finishing first. There's no prize for reading really fast. In fact, if you read too fast, you're often going to miss important things in the literature. You're going to miss important meanings or important events or important references that you need to know, that you need to be aware of. But you're reading too fast, you don't notice them, you don't understand them, you don't recognize their importance, and therefore you're going to struggle with the overall meaning of the text. So reading slowly is better than reading fast. But really, you just need to find a pace that's comfortable for you. You don't need to go super slow, but you don't need to go super fast either. Find a comfortable, manageable pace that you'll be able to maintain for an extended period of time. Remember that sustained attention. You need to be able to read for longer than just 5 or 10 minutes. So find a pace that suits you, but don't try to go too fast. Don't skim, don't browse, read everything. And also, don't be afraid to reread. The book talks about this. Sometimes we're not going to understand everything on our initial reading. And don't feel bad if this is the case. This is the case for professionals as well. This is true for critics, scholars, professors of literature. Sometimes we have to go back and reread too because we missed something or because we didn't initially understand something. It didn't quite click. It didn't quite make sense for us the first time around. So we have to go back. And I get it. Sometimes students don't want to do this. You might think, I don't have time to go back and reread. Or you might think, I just don't want to. I've read it once and that's enough. But if you really want to understand, if you really want to know and understand the text, sometimes you have to go back and reread. Not the entire thing necessarily. Now, if it's a very short work of literature, like a short poem, there's nothing wrong with going back and reading that poem a second or third time. But if you're reading a pretty lengthy short story, you might not be able to go back and reread the entire short story, but you might be able to go back and reread a very important passage. That means like a paragraph or two, or maybe a chapter, maybe a page. Maybe a really important event is taking place there. Maybe a really big plot development is occurring or some really important dialogue between characters and you missed something or you didn't quite grasp it the first time around. Go back and reread that page or that chapter and that might be enough for you. But don't be afraid to do that. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you or you're not reading well. Doesn't mean that you're deficient in any way. In fact, good readers often reread. That's a sign of good reading, good, active, critical reading. So you have to be willing to ask questions. It's okay if you don't understand everything right away. That's part of the process. Part of the analysis and interpretation process is figuring things out. And again, that means going back and revisiting the text sometimes. So go back, reread, ask questions, examine some of your pre-existing beliefs, think hard about meaning. These are all important aspects of reading literature, and we need to do all of that throughout the semester. So now let's get back to annotation. I mentioned that. Now let's get into the specifics. What does it mean to annotate? Some of you may have done an annotated bibliography in the past. That's not quite what we're talking about here. When we talk about annotating within the reading context, what that means is basically taking notes as you read. Taking notes as you go. And again, I get it. A lot of students don't want to do this because we feel like maybe it slows us down. We don't have time to write stuff down as we're reading. I know. I understand that feeling, but I encourage annotation at every level. I teach this in 101, 102, this class, and I talk about it with my 400 level students as well. That's how important I think it is. All good readers, all college level readers, especially when we're reading literature, we have to annotate. It's really not optional, it's essential. So when we annotate, we're basically doing three things, and the book covers all of this in chapter 2. We are first underlining or highlighting important passages, important sentences, important words, in some cases, things that matter to us. All right? We are underlining or highlighting important stuff. Things that matter to us, things that make an impression on us, things that we have ideas about, questions about, or other thoughts about. So there's no right or wrong answer as far as what you choose to underline or annotate. The only thing to keep in mind is that, to underline or highlight. The only thing to remember is you don't want to underline or highlight everything. You want to underline or highlight the most important things, the things that you might revisit, the things that you might later talk about, write about. You want to go back to those. So you're creating a record. You're creating a record here that you can use later. So when you're reading, it's good to have that pen or that highlighter in hand so you can underline as you go. Now, if you're reading online, if you're using an ebook, it might be a little bit more difficult to do this. Some of us might have an annotation feature in our PDF reader where you'll be able to highlight on your computer. But even if you can't do that, you can always jot stuff down as you're reading on a separate sheet of paper. But you always want to create a record of the most important stuff in that literary text. All right, so that's the first part of annotating. The second part is just jotting down general observations, thoughts, ideas. Look in the book. If you go through chapter 2, you'll see some of the examples that they're providing. They're showing you what annotations look like, the kinds of things that you can write in the margins of your page. That means the sides of the page on either side of the actual text that you are reading. So in the old days, when we read everything in physical copies, we would write on, in our books. We would jot down, thoughts, ideas, observations in the margins. It's very informal. Nobody else is going to read your annotations other than you. So they are strictly for you. They are there to help you. So you can write down anything you want. And generally, we develop a sort of shorthand when we annotate. We might abbreviate words. We don't really have to write in complete sentences. Again, it doesn't matter if your notes make sense to anybody else, as long as they make sense to you. And then finally, the third part of annotating is asking questions. You can jot down some questions in the margin of the page along with your ideas, your observations, your general thoughts. And if you're reading online, like I said, you can write all of this on a separate sheet of paper. So we should always be annotating, whether we're marking up a book or whether we're just creating all of this in a separate document because we're reading online. It really doesn't matter. So a few other things that the book mentions in reference to annotating. Talk to the text. Talk back to the text. I think it is good to maintain sort of a running dialogue with whatever work of literature you're reading. Act like you're talking to the author. What do you mean by that? Why is the character doing this? What do you mean when you say this? What does this image mean? What is the importance of this particular event? Now, obviously, the author is not going to answer you, but eventually you might be able to provide answers to those questions. That can give you some structure. That can give you a purpose to pursue as you continue to analyze and work with the text. You can try to answer some of those questions that you wrote down. So you can always be talking to the author. Also, look for any distinctive features of language. That means like certain words are getting repeated. Repetition always matters. So if you notice that a certain word or a certain phrase is getting repeated a lot, you need to make a note of that. Jot something down about that. Maybe underline a few examples of that word or that phrase because it keeps appearing throughout the text. Those kinds of things matter. Look for patterns. You might find a certain recurring pattern of images. Or other things that you notice, aspects of language that you notice, even weird stuff with like grammar or punctuation. That matters. You should take a note. Make a note of that if you notice it, because that's stuff that you might be able to work with later if you choose to write about that literary text. These are things you can explore further. These are things you can talk about at length. So again, we're creating like a written record of our reading experience. So when it's time to work with that text that we read, now we have stuff underlined, we have our observations, our thoughts, we have questions written down, so we're ready to do some more work with the text if we need to. Right? Because we're not going to remember everything, even if you think you have a good memory. Humans are notoriously bad at remembering what we read. So if you read a poem in June and you're trying to write about it in late July or early August, there's just no way that you're going to remember it. You need annotations. You need those notes. You need those questions to get you jump started. Another thing to remember is that once you have your annotations written down, you can convert them into something more polished, something a little bit more formal that you might be able to use later. So sometimes we'll turn our annotations into more detailed notes. Because again, annotations are often very rough and they're often written in shorthand. So they're not always complete thoughts. So we might want to convert them into complete sentences or even paragraphs. And some students like to keep a reading journal where you either put your annotations or after making your annotations, you go ahead and do a journal entry for that particular literary text. The journal entry will just give you a chance to kind of think more and talk more about the literature based on what you just read and based on what you just wrote down in your notes. So you can kind of create a more polished response in your reading journal, and you might be able to use that response later on. All right, so I want to go ahead and wrap up here. So the final thing that I wanted to cover from chapter 2 is, once again, questions. We've been talking about asking questions, but make sure you write down the 4 types of questions that you can ask anytime you're reading literature. So the book goes through these. The first type would be questions about the text itself. Okay, so obviously we want to ask some of those questions. We're going to be spending a lot of time with the actual literary text. So this means that you might be thinking about the genre that this text falls in. What kind of literature is it? Is it fiction? Is it poetry? Is it drama? And then within those larger genres, we can have subgenres and subdivisions based on subject matter. So we can, ask questions about that. We can ask questions about the structure of the text, how it's built, how it's made, how it works. Also, the style. How does it sound? How does it read? So we can always ask questions about the text. We'll be spending a lot of time thinking and talking about these literary texts and obviously asking questions about them. But then the second area of questioning would be questions about the author. We're not going to spend as much time asking questions about authors, but that is something that we can do. We can think about the lives of authors. We can think about certain biographical elements from the authors' lives that might have significance, that might, matter within the literary work. So we can think about the authors. We can also think about cultural context. That's the third type of question. You can think more about the cultural context. That means the particular time and place that the literature is happening in, right? This is the historical time period, but it's also the geographical location. So where are we in this work of literature, and what time period is it? Is it the present day? Are we in the future? Or are we in some past historical period? This is often very important to know a little bit about the context, the historical context and the cultural context that surrounds the literature. So we can ask questions about that stuff. And then finally, we can ask questions about readers. We can ask questions about how readers are responding to the literature. How do readers feel? What do readers think? What is the reception of the text? How are people taking it? What are people saying about it? And how do people feel about it? So we're always interested in readers because, of course, we are readers. So we're always interested in our own thoughts, our own opinions, and our own experiences. So be sure to check out that checklist for good reading that you find in chapter 2. And also, they give you those questions for active reading as well. And they do it for each of our major literary genres. So they give you questions to ask about fiction, questions to ask about poetry, and questions to ask about drama. So we'll talk more about those genres next week. And we're going to actually get started on reading some literature next week. The final thing I will mention here before I forget, and they talk about it in the book, make sure that you're using reference materials when you're reading. This will help you to answer some of your questions, and this will also help you to arrive at a greater understanding of the literary text. So usually you're going to find the need to look up words online. You're going to find words that you probably don't recognize, especially if we're reading stuff that's old, stuff from previous eras. There's going to be references, words, people, things that you don't recognize. So you need to look them up. And luckily, we all have Google. So you can look up virtually anything on Google. Just type it in. You might need to find the definition of a word, or you might need to use an online encyclopedia in order to learn a little bit more about a country or a historical event or a person or something else that's, featured or mentioned in the literature. But you can do that in just a matter of minutes. Never hesitate to look up a word, to try to learn a little bit more about a time or a place, because that's just going to help you later. That's going to help you arrive at a better understanding. Use dictionaries, encyclopedias, and sometimes when we're reading, we'll even notice that there might be footnotes at the bottom of the page, because again, if we're reading old stuff, oftentimes the editors of the book will help us a little bit, and they might tell us what a particular word means or why the character is doing something, because it's very much based on that time and place, and we might not be very familiar with it in the year 2022. So the editors can help you, the internet can help you, and I can help you. Another thing they mention in the book is that a lot of older literature has a lot of references to the Bible and like ancient mythology, because back in the 1800s, 1700s, everybody learned about that stuff, mostly in school, and almost any reader would have been expected to be familiar with the Bible and very familiar with like Greek mythology. Nowadays, we're often not as familiar, and I include myself in that. We're not as familiar with some of that stuff. So again, we often need footnotes. Wikipedia or other online encyclopedias to help us just kind of get straight on a few of these words or concepts that we might encounter when we're reading. So don't get discouraged. Again, it's supposed to be challenging. You're not going to understand everything initially. Be willing to look stuff up and try to answer some of your questions. All right, so that's it for week 1. Let me know if you need anything, if you have any questions, or if you're having any problems accessing Web Campus or finding our textbook. Next week, we will not be reading a textbook chapter. Instead, we're going to be reading some examples of literature. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to approach the literature. We'll talk about the writing process, and we'll talk about the different kinds of writing about literature that we're going to be doing this semester. So I'll see you next week, and let me know if you need anything.